This video covers section 2.3 to 2.5 of the textbook Building Java Programs, and it covers for loops. Now, in the previous lecture videos and in your previous work, we have discussed declarations. These are also kind of statements. And we have worked on assignment statements. In this lecture, we will talk about repetition statements. There are two major repetition structures in most programming languages. There is for loops and there is while loops. We will cover while loops later on in chapter 5, but this chapter introduces the idea of repetition statements and the idea of for loops. For loops are also called count control loops, and while loops are condition control loops. And because we have not done how to build conditions, and we will do that in chapter 4, we will cover while loops in chapter 5. And because we know how to introduce counting, we can start with for loops and we can introduce repetition or repeatedly execute a statement. As you can see, this also ties in with our idea of eliminating redundancy. So let's get started. And I'm going to go into your Canvas course. And let's look at this example. Here what we would like to do is print the numbers 1 to 10. So far, the only tool that we have is the println statement. And so we write this one under the other. And then what I'm going to do is just copy this into my JGrasp. I've got A. So now I have got these 10 statements. I'm going to compile this and let's run it. All right, public static void count. I think what we need to do is public static void main. The main method was missing. String args, and then now we have a method called count, and tidily we call count in here. Count is defined here, and count is called here. So call count to print a list of 10 numbers. So let's try to compile that, and now we run it. And as you can see, here it has printed 10 numbers. The question for us is that if we wanted, for example, to print 100 numbers, are we going to deal with 100 lines of code? That is a very burdensome kind of activity. So when we would like to repeat an action over and over again, we would like to be able to have a tool that allows us very easily and simply to repeat actions or repeat tasks. So here what I'm going to do is I'm going to delete this and see if there's a way that I can do that. And it turns out that I can use a for loop. So I say for integer, and we'll go into the syntax of this in a minute, I is equal to 1, I less than equal to 10, I plus plus. Here I would like to do system.out.println I. And as you can see, I have replaced 10 statements with just a couple of statements. So let's try and compile this and run this. And then we know that it gives us the exact same result. So there are several things that we'd like to talk about here. I'd like to copy this onto the PowerPoint slide here. So here is the code. Let's try to make it bigger. So here's the code that we used to draw those 10, to write out those 10 lines. What this does, this says is let's keep a counter and initialize the counter. So this is the initialization. Because remember, if you'd like to repeat things, we need to have a counter. So we're initializing I, and I, typically it's called I. You can give this any name, but for now we're just going to call it I. And this is the test. So this is the initialization, this is the test, and this is the increment. What this says is start with, create a variable. So this is, as you can see, this is a declaration. Integer I is a declaration. And you're actually using assignment to assign the value 1 to it. So we create I, and then we assign the value 1 to it. So this is what happens when you enter the for loop. The first thing that happens is the initialization. And then what it's going to do after the initialization, it is going to test. It tests is I less than equal to 10 because we only need to do it 10 times and we don't want to exceed. So it checks and the answer is it is less than. So it's going to go ahead and print I, which is it's going to print 1. After it prints I, it's going to go here and increment. So I is going to become equal to I plus plus here is the same as I is equal to I plus 1. And this is going to get, I is going to get to 2. It does not now go back into initialization, but it's going to increment. And after it increments, it's going to go into the test and check if I is less than equal to 10. Yes, it is. So it's going to print the number 2. And so on and so forth till we reach the number 9. It has printed 9. It's going to go and increment. I is going to be equal to 10. And it's going to check is I is less than equal to 10. Yes, it is. It's going to go and print the number 10. After it prints the number 10, it's going to go back again and increment I. So I is now going to be equal to 11. And after it increments, it's going to do the check. Is I less than equal to 10? The answer is no. I is greater than 10. That means this test has failed. And when this test fails, the for loop exits. It does not execute the print. It comes down and executes the next statement after that. Right now, we don't have a statement, but if it were, this is what it would do. Now, note that a few things. One is we don't need to start always with 1. We can start with any number. We don't need always to end at 10. This can be any number that's important to us. This can also not just be a literal, but it can also be an expression. For example, I less than 3 times 20, for example, or I less than 3 times k, where k is a number that has been initialized before. K is equal to 2, for example. So this can be an expression. And this increment, it can be I is equal to I plus 5. So this is the simplest form of the for loop header that we can create. Now, we can do something else also. For example, I could have started with, I'm going to get a new slide. I can do something like for integer, note the bracket here, for integer, I is equal to 10, I greater than equal to 1, I minus minus, I minus minus. You can do system.out.println I. And guess what this is going to do? This is going to print numbers in reverse order and so on all the way up to 1, because we start at 10, make sure that I is greater than equal to 1, and keep reducing I. So first I is going to be equal to 10, then it becomes 9, because instead of the increment, there's a decrement going on here. And now we have to modify the test. We can test if I is less than equal to 10 because, we are starting off with 10. So if you change conditions, you have to make sure that you change the test and change the increment or decrement accordingly. There's one more thing that I wanted to point out, that you can, for example, add, just going to use my eraser here. We can, instead of executing one statement, we can execute a block of statements. So instead of just printing I can also system.out.println, I can print 3 stars as a separator. In this case, both this statement and this statement will get repeatedly executed, and therefore I will have 10 star star star, 9 star star star, 8 star star star, and so on until we reach 1 star stars, and then it will exit. So this is a statement block, and we can do that too. Another thing to keep in mind is that if we have integer I here, we cannot introduce another variable inside called integer. This is will be a double declaration. This integer declaration is as though there is already an int I here declared inside this block, and you can't declare another variable. You can declare variables like int j is equal to 4, but that is fine because there is no clash and we don't have two variables of the same name. So inside this block, we can in fact have a declaration statement, we can have an assign statement, we can even have a method call. So let's say print stars, instead of system out println this, I could have print stars method call, where this one is printing the 10 stars. So inside this loop, we can insert whatever statements or method calls we have learned so far and which we'll be learning in the future. So this is one thing. Another thing to keep in mind with regard to the for loop is that we must make sure that the loop executes as many times as expected. What is the meaning of this? So what we're saying is, if you would like the loop to execute 10 times, make sure that it does execute 10 times and not 89 times, or not at all, 0 times, or infinitely. Keep continuing forever. Can this happen? Yes, absolutely, it can happen. And let's look at how this can happen. So, for example, if I say for, I'd like the loop to execute 10 times, and I say for integer, I is equal to 1, and then I say I is less than equal to 0, I plus plus. And here I'd like to print I. Right? So initialization, I is equal to 0, I is equal to 1. And then when we go to the test, we're checking if I is less than equal to 0. This test fails right away and it does not even enter the loop. How did this happen? Because we just accidentally forgot to put the 1 here and we just put a 0. Therefore, straight off the bat, the condition failed and therefore this loop did not get executed. The other thing that can happen is we do set this. So this is the case where it did it 0 time. Here we have I less than equal to 10, but then we forgot to do I plus plus, or we did I is equal to I plus 4, and then instead of executing 10 times, it's actually executing 2 or 3 times, because the first time I is going to be equal to 1, second time I is going to be equal to 5, third time I is going to be equal to 9, and then it's going to be equal to 13. So we end up executing 3 times instead of. So we have to make sure we build this condition. The third thing that can happen is we can do accidentally, instead of I plus plus, we borrowed somebody's code and then it became I minus minus. When this happens, I is going to start with 1. I is less than or equal to 10, so this test is going to be true. And then we execute print I, so it's going to print 1. And then we do I minus minus, so now I is equal to 0. So I is equal to 1, I is equal to 0. And then we go back and do the test. Yes, I is less than 10. So print I, and then what we're going to do is we are going to print 0 because I minus minus was equal to I became 0. And then the third time it's going to decrement I, so I becomes negative 1. And then I is still less than or equal to 10, so it's going to print negative 1. And because this test will never fail, the smaller the numbers become, the negative, they are never going to exceed 10, and therefore this program will go running forever, and this is the situation of infinite loop. We can also do accidentally something like I have an integer j is equal to 89, right? And then I do for integer I is equal to 1, and then we say j greater than let's say 80, and then I plus plus. So we have accidentally, instead of putting I, we've put in j here, and this test is always going to be true because we forgot and we are not doing anything, no computation with j here. So therefore this loop is never going to stop because j is going to continue to be greater than 80. Or if accidentally we put j less than 10 here, this loop will never get executed because j is not getting changed anywhere, and the first time you enter here, j is going to be less than. So this is how the for loop works, and I would just like to, before I do examples inside practice set, which is what I want to do, I would like to show from your CSC15 the decision structure, and our original thing was I less than equal to 10. So I'm going to say I is less than equal to 10 here. So that this is as though you've got an initialization, integer I is equal to 1. Check if I is less than equal to 10. And if the answer is yes, then go ahead and print I. And then what we're going to do is we're going to say increment I, so I is plus plus, and then what we're going to do is go back and here, right here under the integer 1, and keep checking. And if this test fails, we're going to stop here. So this is how the the for loop structure works. Now what I'd like to do is I'd like to go into practice it and do some examples. Some of these examples have to do with nested loops, so I would like you to be sure that you So let's look at an example to print something like this. You do have an example of that type in your practice set. So let me see if we can do that. So here we've got an example here in which we would like to print this picture. Before we do that, I would like for us just to print a simple line of stars. And let's go into our JGrasp, and because we would like to print stars, and how many stars are we going to print? So we have to count and say 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 stars. So now what I'd like to get myself a for loop because I know I have to repeat those stars. And I say start with I is equal to 1, I is less than or equal to 5, because this one is going to be change the name to print 5 stars. And this method to print a line of 5 stars. That's what we're going to do. So and now not print. So I'm going to make a mistake here and then we'll fix it. So just print the star. So okay, so I'm calling print 5 stars. So let's compile and run this. And now I see that I have got a vertical line of stars, whereas I actually wanted a horizontal line of stars. So I'm going to change the println to print. And now I compile it and I run it, and then I see that I get it. So, but this hasn't solved my problem completely, because I need 1, 2, 3, 4 lines of stars. So let me see if I can, instead of printing 5 stars, what I need is I need a way to print 5 stars 4 times. So I can do one of two things, right? What I can do is I can say, create another loop for integer j is equal to 1, j less than equal to 4, j plus plus, and I'm going to call this print stars program. So you see, I'm inside this, I've got an outer loop to take care of the 4 lines, and I've got an inner loop that actually prints 5 stars. This is not going to be 100% correct, and we'll fix it. So now let's do this. And I discover instead of having 4 lines of stars, I'm having 1 line with 20 stars. So what happened? What happened was I called this print star, and print star did the print, and then that was all. There was no new line anywhere. So what I can do is either I can introduce a print line here, or I can introduce the print line here. Let me introduce the print line here. System.out.println. So I introduce. So now you see this still will not work, and we'll see in a minute why. Oh, semicolon. And then here. This still did not work. Why did that not work? That's interesting, because even though I indented it and put it right under the print stars, it's still not part of the 4 because I did not include this inside a block. And I need to do that. I need to do that to make sure that inside the for loop, I'm calling the print stars and the print line statement. So now let's see if this fixes it. And now you see I've got my answer. So this is an example of how you can call a method inside a for loop, and also if that method contains a loop in itself, that's absolutely fine, right? Now I'm going to go into practice it and redo this problem using a nested loop, and I'd just like you to stay with me here. What I've done here is, instead of the outer loop calling a method, I've actually taken this code here, which is print stars. See that? And instead of calling print stars, I can actually insert this for loop, nest the for loops. So what's happening here is, what I'm saying is, this is the j, which is the rows. I is equal to 1, rows less than equal to 4, and I should not forget, I should do rows, not j, as otherwise I will get myself into a problem. So the outer one does the lines, so line by line. The inner one is the faster for loop, which actually spins around printing the stars. And when this inner loop is done, then what I have is I print the output statement. So the for loop, the outer for loop, is responsible for going row by row. the inner for loop is responsible for going column by column. I can even say columns is equal to 1, cols less than thing, and column plus plus. Print the stars. So when you do nested, whenever you have a table-like structure, then the important thing for us is to understand that there's a row column situation, and I will just go into my PowerPoint and go over that. So when you have a situation like this, then what we're saying is we've got, these are the rows, row 1, row 2, row 3, and row 4. And this is column 1, column 2, column 3, column 4, and column 5. Therefore, we first print the horizontal line. First, we go to row 1 and start with column 1 and print all the way to column 5. And then we go to row 2 and then go back to column 1 and print all the stars up to column 5. Then we go to row 3, go back to column 1 and print all the way to column 5, and so on. So if we write a loop which is for row is equal to 1, row less than equal to 4, row plus plus, then we are going to initialize row is equal to 1, test is row is equal to 4, and come down here first. When we come down here, we get entangled into another for loop, so which is column is equal to 1, column less than equal to 5, column plus plus, and then here, this initialization takes place, this check takes place, and then we print the star, and then increment the column and keep printing the stars till this condition fails, and then we come out and then we go back to the increment here. So then row becomes equal to 2. When row becomes equal to 2, then this statement, so we come back to the statement that needs to be executed, which is the second time this inner for loop is going to get executed. Go back to column, so we are at row number 2, column number 1, and then it's going to go all the way, print all of these stars, and then this is going to exit this for statement, and then go back again. The increment is going to happen. Row is now going to be equal to 3, and then it's going to come down to the inner for loop, restart this whole thing, column is equal to 1, and then print all of these stars, exit, go back to incrementing, and row number 4. So finally, when you've printed the 4 rows and row becomes equal to 5, that's when we exit out of all of this and come down here and not fall into this thing here. So this is how the nested for loop situation works. So, and that's the way I have done it here, that inside the loop you print the stars, row is equal to 1, and then print this. So this is how you can do this example. And now let's look at the triangle example here. Now what we are asked to do is print in the first line, print 1 star, second line, print the second star, third line, print the third star, and so on. So let's get started. For integer, row equal to 1. How many lines do we have? 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Row is equal to 1, row less than equal to 5, row plus plus. I'm just going to get myself a block just in case. And then now I have to print the inner loop. And as you can see, the first time I need to print 1, second time I need to print 2, and third time, so I don't have an exact number here for integer column equal to 1, column less than equal to something, and column plus plus. I've got to system.out.print star, and then here, when I'm done with all of this, I have to give a print line but how many times should this inner star be printed? The first time it's 1, the second time it's 2, the third time it's 3, and then I'm thinking the first time it has to print 1 star, so which is the same as row number 1. Second time row is equal to 2 and 2 stars are printed. Third time row is equal to 3 and 3 stars are printed. Now is the situation where the inner variable is dependent on the outer variable. And it looks like while col is less than equal to row. And this is one thing you can keep in mind when you're drawing patterns and pictures, that because you can put any expression here, if the number of things that you want to do is tied to the outer loop variable, then it's perfectly fine to put this here. So let's see if this actually solves our problem. So this appears to solve our problem, and therefore we have printed it. So remember, your column, the number of things that you do inside, can depend on which position you are inside the row. So let's go and do numbers here. So instead of stars, what we are doing is we're doing numbers. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And here I can do for integer row equals to 1, row less than equal to 7, row plus plus, and then I say, now I have to go into the inner loop for integer column equals to 1, column less than equal to row, because it's going to print 1 time, and then column plus plus, and then here I'm going to do system.out.print. What are we going to print? What are we going to print? We need to print numbers, but which number? It looks like we have to print the row number, and therefore it's perfectly fine for me to say print row here, and it'll print the value of the row. Let's see if we're actually following input. There we go. So this is now solved the problem. So you can use these solutions to move through and solve and create many pretty patterns. This one needed me to print spaces. It needed us to print spaces before we print the number. So we are printing spaces here and then printing the number. And I've used a descending loop right here. You can use a descending loop to print this one. So this is an overview of how to do practice in your practice it. And a lot of the exam questions are pulled out of practice it. So it's definitely worth your while to practice this.